Welcome to the T's and C's.
Tisa and Chantel.
Also known as the Terms and Conditions.
Welcome to another episode of T's and C's The Reflection, our weekly mini-sode during the COVID-19 global pandemic. I am a little bit giddy, but I need to control myself because we keep getting overexcited with the legends that we've had on the podcast. So let me just calm myself before I introduce this person. A legendary feminist, digital sociologist, probably one of my favourite people that analyses class in the world. Absolute legend, someone that supported us on the podcast from the beginning, someone who has just been such an important motivator, inspiration to so many people in academia. With pleasure, please welcome Professor Bev Skeggs. Hi, Bev.
Wow, what a welcome. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I don't mean to embarrass you, Bev. You're brilliant.
You. That's very, very kind.
Today we're going to be talking about Solidarity and Care, which is a new public platform by the Sociological Review. Could you tell us a little bit about this, Bev?
Yeah, the idea behind it was to rethink how we can live together, both through a pandemic and, if we survive it, how we can live after a pandemic. Because, you know, everything we know from history, everything we know from studies of pandemics is that they are really, really serious. And now we're in it. Now we know. But I think at the beginning, I was very concerned that we had a sociological voice going through what it meant to live through a pandemic. And I was also really, really concerned to document stories of how people looked after each other, how people cared for each other, and the types of support and solidarity that we see. So I think I'd learned by understanding lots around austerity that there were lots of local initiatives going on to support people who were in difficult circumstances. There was a lot happening that we never heard about. We heard about mean people, we heard about cruel people, we heard about people who were using the system. And I think mainstream media got more and more vindictive about the vulnerable and about those who were actually suffering. I felt we needed alternative stories of how people do actually care about each other, how people do support each other, and that we're not all individualistic, greedy and cruel people. And I think sociologists have always studied forms of solidarity. They've always studied social relations. So I just felt we needed somewhere where we could actually have a document of all that. Also, I think it's very important when you see all those local stories of solidarity and care, that we use those against what we now see coming. We use those stories to say, no, people do care about each other. They really, really do. They're not all brutal individualists. And so I wanted to have an archive that could store and contain all of that material.
Bev, I'm going to say something, right? You know when someone has a really good idea, you know it's a good idea when it seems like common sense. You think, well, that's obvious, right?
Yeah.
But that's the thing, because that's such a good idea, but no one thinks of it.
It is such a good idea.
It's such a good idea because I think what always gets lost is the stories of real people, how they cope in crisis.
Yeah.
And it allows someone like, so for example, the Blitz, for example, the people, the elite, it allows them to take that narrative and generate a myth.
Exactly.
And if you speak to the people how it really was at that time, they'll tell you something completely different.
Yeah. And I think we need so many more alternative stories at the moment. You know, we don't get them. They're very, very hard to find. And I think after the coverage of Brexit, after the closing down of British media in really traditional ways, after the demonisation of the working class in all its varieties, I just felt that the world I was living in was actually quite different. It was a world where people did look out for each other, where they did speak across differences, where they would do things for each other. And it just felt very, very different. And I felt increasingly that world was not being recognised publicly at all. 4 weeks in, when we had lots of difficulties around how do we build a platform, licensing, ethics, with withdrawal of people, different medium. I mean, it was quite complex. There were 9 of us. So it wasn't just me. There was a team of 9 of us in the end trying to get this thing to work. It had to be done. And I think now I'm really, really pleased it has.
It reminds me, Bev, and I think it was you actually a number of years ago now. I remember talking to you about, I think, my life and whatever, and you basically explaining to me, then prompting me to look at reading about care and how you explained to me how care itself was something that sociology needed to be concerned with. And that's not something that I'd come across up until PhD level for a variety of reasons. But like, thinking about solidarity and care, it's just something that being caring, as in whether it's with parents, partners, children, whatever, it's just something that's always been sort of common sense to me, or something that's just been part of my life. And I've not really understood how political it is. That sounds, I always say really basic things on this podcast, but I'm just being honest. I didn't realise how integral it is for us to understand these things as sociologists and document them, as you say.
It's a really hard one because I don't want to make vast generalizations. Our dispositions towards each other have become much more callous and competitive. And you see that, I mean, academia breeds competition. It breeds insecurity. It breeds narcissism. It breeds egos. And I think it's really hard to build care into that. But if you're a supervisor of students doing dissertations, struggling, PhD students, or early career scholars who, don't know where the next job's coming from, or people even much later on trying to get grants, I think we need care. And I was lucky enough to work with quite a few people who were caring, but that's not always the case. I had an experience where, not a lot of care. And so I think it made me really, really think about what sort of worlds do we want. And I made a choice recently to take up a new job because I thought I'm old, I'm getting near the end of my career, and I just want to be with, and I had 3 criteria, and they had to be caring, they had to be funny, they had to be clever. I wanted to kind of laugh, be cared for, care for other people, because I think caring for other people is important. I think we like, most of us like to care for other people, and I wanted to have fun. So I think these are the things we underestimate in what is a very brutal, cruel world, I think.
So growing up, I would say, without what I was socialized to believe is very instrumental versions of human nature. Through the music I was consuming, through the pop culture I was consuming, it's about looking after number one. And then the jobs I pursued in the city was the same thing. So those attributes, like having a sense of humor or being nice to people, they were seen as a weakness. Everyone you dealt with was on an instrumental level. So I could be nice to you, but for a reason. Yeah. It's all very instrumental and very efficient. So I'm looking for the quickest way to get my result. I don't really care about you per se. I might tolerate you, but there's no care involved. I tolerate you. Ambivalent towards you, really. And that has been the kind of guiding ethos almost. So when I look at kids, when I was doing some mentoring with kids, I would see that in that part inside to them.
I feel like what Bev's saying is, right, we live in this neoliberal, like in the shadow of Thatcher's society, like that is what we live in. But there are people day to day within our lives that are resisting these things. So even though that experience is definitely accurate here, and you're always, I feel like you're daily we're pushed to not act in a way that is neoliberal, but often we do because that is the society we live in. But at the same time as those things existed and how we're brought up and what have you. And I think class plays into what you're talking about as well, T, really importantly.
Equally, like, it's not that it's like I was just one way. Those things of caring, they exist with me all the time, but you repress them at certain points. Like I said, I see that I would see acts of caring every day in that environment still, in a high pressured environment. Even though it's not the mainstream discourse, it still exists in that ether. So it's a case of where they exist uncomfortably next to each other. There's a tension between care and that instrumental nature of neoliberalism. Because you can't be so efficient all the time. You're a human being, and that's the tension, right?
Yeah, and we need love, we need nurture, we need kindness. Otherwise, what would we be? We'd be machines. And I entered the world differently because I had a father who was very selfless. He repaired everybody's things. He had in the road. He did everything. He would always be looking after somebody. And my mum would be the same. My mum was called a doormat by some of the neighbours because people walk all over her. But basically, she was just looking after people. And I thought, what's wrong with looking after people? And so I think I grew up with my father really saying, stop being selfish if I ever wanted anything. So when I enter the world of theorising individualism, theorising competitiveness, I find it really weird because I can see it institutionally. I can see it in universities. I can see it around me. But a lot of what I learned and a lot of the people I know are still actually really, really kind. And they would prioritise care and kindness over anything else. Because they know, I think if you don't have a lot, you rely on other people to share things. If you think everything's going to fall apart, as it often does, is working class communities, the proximity to everything suddenly collapsing, you rely on other people who are around you much, much more because things could all go wrong suddenly. So you're never going to be brutal to your neighbour or nasty to them in the sense that you may need to rely on them at some point. And I think we lost a lot of that. I grew up with a lot of that, and I think we lost it. And we lost it in sociology. People started theorising about individualism and about risk, and that's why I wrote against all that. And I think we lost it in academia because we're made to be really, really competitive with each other, for the ref. People used to start talking about people as if they were real subjects in terms of their ref grading. That person's a 5-star. What?
Bev, just for the purpose of our listeners that aren't academics that don't understand the ref, could you just summarise what the ref is?
Oh, the ref is this competitive system that measures one's productivity and performance in academia, and it measures it in terms of where you've published, what you've published, and it changed criteria every 4 years. It's now every 6 years. It used to be the quality of your publication, then it became the amount of publications, then it became the amount of research money you had. So it's just like a performance measure that constantly changes, leading people to feel ridiculously insecure because they never really know what they're meant to be doing, because academic work doesn't work at that speed. So it's a performance measure, really.
Very neoliberal. All about outputs,
very
right?
Neoliberal, very, very.
But you could see why it can generate in people that kind of insecurity because you measure your success by the amount of things you have, your output, right?
Yeah.
And like I said, in the place where I am now, people get great care to show you how much they have. The bigger house they've got, the nicer doors they have, the bigger cars. Yeah. The people out here with electric cars, so they've got their own electric power things outside.
Oh,
how much they're looking after the environment. So. And I can see it in the kids, things matter. Having things matter. Yeah, it's the performance, right? Yeah. I have to have the latest trainers, right? If I don't have the latest trainers, I'm considered poor. I don't belong. I get marked out. Having things is an outward sign that I belong to a group. Yeah. And that shows success in this society, right?
Well, I think belonging there, we underestimate the significance of belonging. And we don't we do now, but we wouldn't necessarily need that pair of trainers to belong. But we do need to belong, and we need to think of other ways in which we belong to other people in different ways. And I don't mean like ownership. I mean how we connect to them.
And I think so. When I was looking at the far right, and I could see there's a kind of shift to that of how do I create belonging or different types of solidarities across different groups. Yeah. Because one of the things in that particular scene is that they had fragmented in the 80s. So they're looking to try and this is what the alt-right did quite successfully. Through culture, they kind of did this. Through bits of culture and like memes and stuff like that to kind of having a sense of humour is what they would call it.
Yeah.
I need to have a side moment with our listeners. Can you believe that Tiso's managed to bring in the alt-right during a conversation about care? I do think it's relevant, but
that's a good contrast, right?
How you can bring them in.
But no, that's the contrast, right? People think they're quite individualistic, horrible people, but they are using the same tactics of care, of humour, to bring disparate groups together. So someone who's a skinhead is quite different from someone who's a member of the Ku Klux Klan. They're completely different. Through humour and kind of disparaging remarks about other groups of people, they've come together. And I'm thinking, well, that's actually quite weird. Through humour, they've united two groups. They found a solidarity.
Yeah, and I think you're onto something there, because there's an amazing book I read about the Ku Klux Klan, the women in the Ku Klux Klan, and it's by Catherine Blee, and it was written in the 80s or 90s. And again, this is where we get complications around care, because these women all really care about each other in the community. So you've got to think it's like any form of any social relation. How is it mobilized for what purposes? So, we've seen with the alt-right, they are the perfect manipulators of anti-authority. While the left squabbles with itself, they just go out there and say that they are anti-authority, and anti-elitism was before. It's the elite saying it. I mean, they play a blinder. Their comm strategies are brilliant at using all these things like solidarity, like care, like belonging, like anti-authority. They manage to pull them together and they send them in a very, very different direction. And I think we need to pay attention to that. So I think it's really good that you brought the alt-right in. Really good.
It is a reminder, and T's always making me keep an eye on what they're doing. It's just like it comes up a lot, but it's important. You're right, T, because they are an important group to be watching consistently. As well, Beth, just thinking about things that you and T were just saying, particularly about neoliberalism and belonging, and also thinking about academia and the rest. What COVID-19 has done has highlighted or made us question, to what value do these things actually have when it comes down to it? We've got, everyone is affected by COVID-19. It's not evenly felt, of course, and that cuts across race and class, but it's really important that we sort of take this moment, what we've been trying to do on the podcast, and think about how we can live differently or try and really contest these neoliberal structures more than ever. Obviously, as you say, Bev, people have been doing this, but maybe now is the time when we can really try and get people to really think about what is of value, or who and what is of value in society.
Totally. And I had no idea when I began the project, the Solidarity and Care Project, that we would end up where we are now. I mean, my God, I'll try not to rant, but I cannot believe that across the world there are governments that are just willing to kill their own populations. And I remember when both my parents were killed by the privatisation of the NHS, and I wrote about that, and I was very, very upset about it at the time, because I had to watch them both die in agony. And that's probably one of the hardest things you can ever do. That motivated me to do this. What I wrote about then was called neglect by design. So I could see that by selling everything off, selling all the health services off, not giving any care at all about care workers or care homes or care agencies. 3,700 different care agencies operate. Nobody knows how to work with them. There's a massive, massive amount of employment. Brexit was literally throwing out loads of care workers. They were leaving because they knew they couldn't get in, they couldn't get paid, they'd have no legality. So I was watching that, set up the Solidarity in Care, and then what we see, and I'm in shock. I'm in shock about the UK. I'm in shock about Sweden. Kind of expected it from Brazil and the US. I'm in shock about the brutal disregard for life. The ability of a government to experiment with its own population as if it's a kind of game theory plan. The cravenness of scientific advisors who just kowtow to government because they're looking for the next research grant, I guess. I mean, it's been shocking. So all the things that I thought were horrific in 2016, after years of austerity, after the privatisation of the NHS, I now cannot believe they've got so much worse. We are now at the logical endpoint of killing what sociologists have called surplus populations, i.e. those that are unproductive for those in society who need to make a profit from them. So what you're seeing at the moment are huge numbers, obviously, 60, I always have them written down, then I have to change them nearly every day, 60,000 excess deaths up to mid-May, 20,000 elderly people killed in care homes. Most elderly people are not in care homes, so think about how many in excess of that exactly. Trauma that care workers are experiencing, the horrors that frontline NHS workers are experiencing, transport workers. So it's like the logic of all those policies that were about neglect these people, kind of let them die slowly, has now been speeded up, and it's like, yep, just let them die quickly. Just let them go. It has been extraordinary. And I can't quite believe it. I had to turn off the news, which I felt compelled to listen to, because it was just so disturbing every day. And then I have friends in Sweden, because I worked in Sweden for a year, and their government, again, callous disregard. This is an experiment for our future. It's all, I do think there are new politics. And if you don't believe me, read Byline Times, watch a journalist called Nafiz Ahmed, who writes about the digital privatisation of the NHS. Look at things like NHSX. Look at the artificial intelligence programs that are being developed by this government. And I feel it's as if we are just an experiment. So I think we have to find other ways of living this experiment. We really do, because, this is malevolent neglect by design now, as one of my friends described it. It's not just neglect by design. Then it's not just purposeful neglect. It's like they actually believe that this is okay.
Mm.
Like, if I properly deep it, like I'm sitting here listening to you, Bev, it's the first time in a couple of weeks that I've properly deeped what is happening, because I kind of have to not go too far, because I can't get out of fucking bed, like, because I find that hard to deal with. But when you actually deep, these people know what they're doing. It's just, there's no words, like.
Yeah. And people say it's bumbling incompetence, and at first I thought, yeah, they are just really, really incompetent. But actually, there's a lot of people behind this. Read, oh God, do I have to talk about Dominic Cummings? I mean, what an arrogant, unbelievable character. But I don't really want to talk about him. I think he's just so disgusting and deplorable. But if you actually read some of his blogs, this is eugenics for a new age. And we should all be really, really worried. Really worried. He believes in this stuff and he calls it science. He's like one of those kids at school who never really knew much about what was going on, but pretended they did by reading really weird books.
Kind of linked it back to kind of Hannah Arendt stuff on Nazism and the Holocaust, like the end game of the Enlightenment. Like, and this is that same kind of thing. The Enlightenment produces these perverse outcomes of efficiency, eliminating people in a very efficient manner. I try not to say this to my friends, because they always say they and they, and it kind of, for them, they creep into conspiracy theory. But I'm trying to say it's this structure that develops its own momentum. Yeah. And when it starts to keep going, it's unstoppable. And it's like unleashing nationalism. Once you open it, it can never be stopped. It has to run its course. And when it does run its course, it always ends in violence, historically speaking.
Yeah, exactly. And pandemics are often a time where we do see them. It's obviously the most vulnerable because they can't protect themselves as much. But there's some really odd outcomes in this pandemic as well, because, the people that it's killing apart from the elderly are BAME groups, and it's killing them in very different ways. But, one of the most significant ways is diabetes too. Really high levels of diabetes too, or lack of vitamin D, which apparently we've known about for years. And vitamin D is really, really significant. If anybody's listening to this program, any BAME populations, just go and get loads of vitamin D, because it really, I've seen all the scientific reports now. It really is significant in the same way as vitamin A was for rickets for working class kids in the 1950s, I think.
Yeah.
My mum makes me take it because it stops, like, especially with mental problems and stuff like that. But I was, when I look at pandemics, and obviously the kind of big thing, the pandemic is an existential threat that comes for everyone. But in the past, because the kind of equipment wasn't there, so I'm thinking back, obviously, like the Justinian plague. So emperor caught the plague, so rich people could die. But right now, rich people are taking measures to protect themselves, right? So the pandemic doesn't really affect them in the same way that it affects us or has affected people in the past. Pandemics before truly affected everyone. But right now, people like Trump can avoid that. They can take, what did he take, that hydrochloric acid? I can't remember what he took.
God, who knows? Who knows?
But before, pandemics would, I'm thinking back to the Great Plague, the 1348, when the Black Death, it was a leveler, a true leveler. But this one, it isn't.
This isn't going to be a leveler. No.
I'd say this is really not a leveler. The statistics are now. I had them written down. I've got so many statistics at the moment. But I think if you're upper middle class, so they're going over the household income of 100,000, your chances of dying are 1 in 23. And we know if you're BAME working class, it's 1 in 4. Statistics are, I need to check to make sure I've got that right, but the statistics are really, really significant in terms of differences. There's been those reports that came out, really significant ones, which again, I need to find, looking at household deprivation and death rates. And things like multi-generational households are really, really significant. Now, who lives in multi-generational households?
I did.
Yeah. You know, so some of these figures are really, really significant. You know, if you live in the countryside, your chances are much lower than if you live in a town and a city. So who lives in towns and cities? If you use public transport, your chances are much higher. I mean, you have to put all these stats together. They're not just single figures. When you put them all together, and you get very different combinations, because doctors obviously are a very high risk group, as are nurses. So, you know, different computations, but really significantly those who were vulnerable through austerity, through health, through housing, through poverty of various different kinds, homelessness, they are so much higher risk categories, so much higher, because they've already got pre-existing problems that, you know, make them vulnerable to a really horrific virus.
I think they're structural, aren't they? That those problems,
Absolutely.
So I've been looking at different countries in Africa and how they've responded to the pandemic. And so I was looking over the tally, and at one point, combined 54 countries had less people had died over the 54 than in Britain. So at one point we had, I think we were just over 30. They were still at 28, 54 countries, right? So I was thinking, so how did these people who are by our definition, economically, materially, the poorest, right, living on less than $1 a day, how are they coping? Living in an informal economy, no lockdown, and they have other diseases. And now COVID-19 had come. But these people were forming relations, performing normally, and they had a repressive government who were willing to beat them, trying to enforce a lockdown, but they were still managed to live a life that seemed almost, they looked happy. They looked like they were going about doing their business. And it was just interesting. How are these people able to function? And then in Great Britain, someone says you can't go outside and everyone has a heart attack. They have a meltdown. The poorest countries in the world were able to get on and live their lives. But here, it seemed problematic. So it was quite a contrast to see the most advanced, best health systems like France compared to Africa, the dark continent.
But there are real differences, and it does depend on the time. Because I think in some countries, because they've had to deal with Ebola, with HIV, they know how to isolate quickly. They know how to do things. So my friend in South Africa was saying, you know, their government policy was actually really good at the beginning. And it was, they had a lot of health workers on the ground who could do a lot of the work, telling people what to do, how to survive, whatever they put in. I mean, you know, all this starts falling apart when people start dying en masse. But at the beginning, it was really, really good policies. And he said it was all because they dealt with HIV on the ground in townships and, trying to make sure that there were health facilities. So I think there are big differences, and there are big differences between wanting to keep your population alive.
Yes, this.
And really not caring, or in Sweden's case, experimenting with them. So I do think there's very, very different approaches. And we do see it. I mean, look at Bolsonaro. I mean, it really, what on earth?
Yeah, he's weird. Why is he saying things like that? Why is he saying that?
You tell me. Something about masculinity there. I mean, him and Trump. I mean, what? It's bizarre. Again, you watch. Yeah.
So vile.
But then you think they're letting people die. You're watching fascination almost, because they're more cartoon than a cartoon. But then you think, but what are they doing? So the idea of freedom, people in Minnesota going out, going to get the virus, going to kill lots of other people in the name of freedom.
Or in the name of religion, like someone is saying, like the Christians, they say God's going to protect me. I'm like,
really? Just look at Iran. It's like, it is very bizarre. And I think if you have a government that wants to protect its population, South Korea, Taiwan, New Zealand, what a complete star that woman is. Suggested a 4-day week, thinking through into how we deal with this in the future. Because I was making a list of where are the worst and where are the best countries in the world. Those who've actually dealt with it really quickly. They had really good advisors. They knew what they were doing. They locked down very quickly in a very specific way. They had people on the ground. They had technology. They had track and trace. And they'd learned from China and they'd learned from Italy. I mean, we just had complete callous disregard of all the knowledge that was coming in.
Special mention to the Caribbean islands.
Yeah. But I think someone like South Korea, I was looking at, and Taiwan, they're two good examples, because I think there's also a kind of an economic motive there. So the chips and the TV screens and all those things, like TSMC make most of the chips that go into most of your computers. Like 90% of the supply comes from Taiwan. And Taiwan's seeking their own independence now from China. So there's a big effort to get on top of these things, and South Korea, and to connect their economies to America, to recouple them. So there's a capitalistic element that kind of runs behind the kind of efficiency of what they got rid of, that they control the virus with.
And they need labour. Japan went all out to protect its labour. We know that there's been an unemployment in this country, and we know that the north of England has been completely disregarded. I think we need to look at those figures very, very carefully.
Well, that is a brilliant place to end. But that was absolutely brilliant, Bev. Just before we go, if our listeners are interested in getting involved with the platform, what do they need to do, or who should be contacting Solidarity and Care? The links will be in the episode notes.
Great. I mean, when we should have thought about this more carefully, but it's Solidarity and Care at sociologicalreview.com. So it's really a long and quite complex thing, but just type in Solidarity and Care and look for the Sociological Review. And they can either contact me, they can contact the editor, Erica Lagalise. And there's lots of explanations about how to contribute, whether you want to be published now or save it for a research archive in the future, all sorts of things, and how to submit photographs, audio visuals, all sorts of things.
Art. I saw you've got some art on there as well.
Well, we're really looking forward to art, because lots of people have suddenly found out they're artists.
They've got time. So blogs, art, letters, all the mediums. It's all sociological.
Whatever gets you through. And for some people, art gets you through. We need to know this. We need to know how people are coping.
Thank you so much for joining us, Bev. That was absolutely brilliant, really inspiring, and lots of food for thought there. Listeners, we'll be back again next week. Bye-bye.
See ya.